The inline web stacks, grubs, and workers show off a new illumination shader we developed especially for this level. We began with concept art for the web stacks, modeled those, then added the material parameter that allows the model's self-illumination to be modified based on the angle at which the player views them. The end result is an object that looks lit from within by a weird volumetric light.
We wanted players to work cooperatively with the Vortigaunt just like they did with Alex in Episode 1. We didn't want to make the Vortigaunt too powerful, or he might take away from the player's fun, but we also wanted him to be a good ally to have around. One solution, shown in this scene, was a shock attack where the Vortigaunt would stun a group of antlions so that the player could finish them off.
The antlion experience in Half-Life 2 was characterized by a mindless, constant onslaught of bugs rushing your way. We devised the antlion worker for Episode 2 as a way to add depth and variety to the underground sequences by leveraging new types of gameplay. Unlike normal antlions, the worker chooses to avoid direct confrontation, skulking in the background and lobbing acidic globs from a distance. This extends the amount of time players spend with each creature. By contrast, an encounter with an ordinary antlion is over in a second. The spitting behavior was derived from the bull squid of Half-Life 1, but was updated to fit the more physical world of Half-Life 2. To that end, the spit globs are not merely sprites, but physically simulated objects, flying through the air along realistic trajectories.
This cave was originally designed with a pit in the middle, so the player could punt antlions into it with a gravity gun. In playtest sessions, however, very few of our playtesters actually used it in this way. The pit stayed in the room, but we changed the path to allow the player to descend into it and come back out.
Texturing of these caves provided a couple of significant challenges. We had never made such a large-scale area completely out of displacements before. The convoluted topology of the surfaces made them especially hard to UV map without unpleasant-looking seams and texture warping. After some early attempts, we decided that we were not going to be able to map this area using conventional UV mapping, so we decided to write custom shaders especially for the caves. Our custom shader combines multiple axis-aligned projections based upon the surface normal. This largely fixed our problems with stretching and seams. Since we wanted to provide dramatic lighting in these areas, particularly when lit by the flashlight, we augmented the source engine's radiosity bump mapping with a new piece of technology. This allowed us to create a form of bump maps in which the bump map surface details actually cast soft shadows across the surface. This emphasizes the surface bumpiness, especially when the light is at grazing angles.
Turning the Vortigaunt into an expressive character was a challenge for animators, given that he doesn't have what you call a traditional face. To bring out his personality, the animators concentrated on shifting body weight and broad hand gestures. Most importantly, where human characters tend to move their heads a lot for emphasis, we concentrated his performances on expressive spinal motions.
Wherever possible, we try to mine our robust physics engine as a source of novel puzzles. It's especially valuable for giving realistic feedback to the player solving the puzzle. In this scenario, we designed the elevator to sink slightly whenever the player steps on it, giving instant intuitive feedback that it reacts to weight. This made it far more likely that the player would understand that he was dealing with a counterweight puzzle.
We like to lull players into a trance, then startle them. Here, we convince players they are expected to explore and solve puzzles for a long time. Then we abruptly change the mode of gameplay by throwing grenade-lobbing zombines at them.
Whenever possible, we try to give the player a glimpse of their eventual goal, even before they realize it is their goal. While we try to design such moments intentionally, sometimes the opportunities present themselves. In this case, while setting up the gag where the rail car slides into the abyss, we opened a hole in the wall and discovered a view of the distant thumper. It became clear that we could tailor the view across the giant cave to foreshadow the spot where Gordon would eventually end up.
The Vorticon's dispel attack is a radial explosion that takes out a swarm of antlions. It looks most impressive when seen from above, but that's not a perspective the player gets very often in the tunnels. We designed the exit from this battle purely to give the player a view from above so the Vor could put on a show.
Originally, this room came directly after a long stretch of combat with antlions, and opened up into more of the same. Players who opened the door were faced with another swarm, which they were expected to clear with a whole bunch of handy grenades. However, most playtesters were fairly tired of antlion combat at this point, so we decided that a complete break from antlions would be an even better alternative to blowing up more of them with grenades.
It brings peaceful thoughts, does it not?
A glimpse of the Antlion Guardian in this level sets up anticipation for the more extended confrontation in upcoming areas. The player needs to know what he's getting into so that the Vortigon's warnings will all make sense.
For most of this episode's development, there was a counterweight puzzle in this area, one the player had to solve while under attack by antlions. Although it was a clever puzzle, we felt the underground experience was already long enough, so we removed it and streamlined the path to the nectar. Having too many obstacles made it hard to keep up the sense that recovering the nectar was an urgent task.
Until we added the wooden landing here, players were very reluctant to jump down into the elevator shaft. Some playtesters went all the way back to the previous level looking for another way down. In the days of Half-Life 1, we depended on players jumping willy-nilly down every elevator shaft they encountered. But over the years, they've learned to be afraid of the things we tend to put down there.
One of the major graphical enhancements we made to the source engine for Episode 2 was the addition of shadow mapping for the player's flashlight. This allows the flashlight to cast soft, dynamic shadows into the world, adding realism and drama to the scene, particularly in dark underground areas like this one, in which the use of the flashlight is required to navigate the space. As you move around, notice that all objects in the world cast and receive realistic shadows from your flashlight.
Early versions of this area had serious problems. It was brutally punishing and unfun. We were trying to make an experience about timing and tension, but playtesters perceive this as another boss battle. But without physics and explosives, there's no way to kill the Guardian. They would empty all their ammunition into him and die horribly over and over before giving up and running away. They hated it. Our first solution to this problem was to add an arena immediately before the maze, where we hoped players would use up most of their ammo and on head crabs and barnacles and not even try to shoot them. But clever players managed to lure the head crabs into barnacles and rush past while the barnacles were feeding, arriving in the Guardian's lair with plenty of ammunition and again, the false impression that they could kill the boss. In the end, it was necessary to have the Vortigaunt tell the player, "Remember, do not kill the Guardian or the extract will be ruined," therefore justifying why you wouldn't be able to do what we didn't want you to do and what you couldn't do in the first place. This area is really fun now. The battle is almost exactly like the original layout. The big difference is that we're communicating our expectations to the player, rather than having them learn by dying.
In Half-Life 2, the Antlion Guard was originally meant to be a sort of superbug bloodhound that pursued the player through caverns and harassed him while he slipped into small spaces to hide. While we never realized that design in Half-Life 2, this scenario is, for the most part, exactly what his original design sought to accomplish. Over the course of many years of production on various titles, we found that ideas often go away into the ether for years or more, only to resurface and thrive in a new game environment. Even failed prototypes can flourish down the road.
Before we simplified the path through the Guardian's lair, we allowed a right turn at this junction, leading the player right back to where they began. One of our playtesters continued to repeatedly turn right here for half an hour. That was a compelling argument for removing the maze-like elements.
The antlion tunnels, carved out by worker antlions using their acid secretions, make up the third of 3 subterranean spaces with a distinctive visual style, man-made mines and natural cave formations being the other 2. The presence of crawl spaces was dictated by game design, but they evolved into chambers that fit logically within the life cycle of the antlions. Here, the young grubs can develop and feed in safety, although, conveniently for the player, they cannot digest useful items such as health kits.
One change we made to Episode 2 was to decouple the flashlight power from the suit power. Playtesters constantly had their flashlight on during the guard chase sequence and were unable to sprint to safety because the flashlight drained their suit's sprint ability. We wanted players to be able to outrun the Guardian with their flashlight shining. Sometimes we are forced to make trade-offs between conventions we've established in earlier installments and gameplay we need now. It would be silly to not have cool-looking underground passages just to keep flashlight behavior consistent until the end of time. As for the rationale within the story, players might assume this new feature was apparently the result of damage sustained in the train crash.
In earlier versions of this map, the tunnels here were more maze-like, with branches, loopbacks, and dead ends. After watching numerous playtesters get lost, it became obvious that they were not having fun. We simplified the paths and added a number of one-way choke points. The curving tunnels still keep the player in suspense, but as long as he keeps moving, he'll continue to progress, with very little time wasted in retracing steps.
In this scene, we wanted the player to feel under tremendous pressure to break through the boards. Ideally, they just barely make it through the opening before the Guardian arrives. To get this effect consistently, we had to reduce the number of boards again and again until we saw playtesters consistently scrambling to safety at the last moment.
In early versions of this map, the player was allowed to drop straight to the bottom of the shaft. Nobody ever saw the Guardian break through the boards. Therefore, we added a small floor area and required the player to turn around to break more boards, making it much likelier that players would see the Guardian's attack.
One of our toughest jobs is tuning for difficulty. There are all kinds of ways that sloppy game design can make players miserable when they're supposed to be enjoying themselves. If the player is laughing as he dies, it's a good sign. It means the death is perceived as part of the entertainment experience, that the player died fairly and not as a result of poor design. But if the playtester is beating his head on the keyboard, we usually take this as a sign that there's still work to be done.
At various times in development, this gear was loose in the environment, tucked in a dark crevice, hidden in a small box, or lost in the bottom of a flooded pool. One playtester, unaware of his low health, actually drowned in 2 feet of water while retrieving the gear. We realized that attaching the gear to a chassis identical to the engine motor was the best way to help the player make the connection between this gear and the empty space on the other assembly.
This puzzle proved surprisingly difficult for many players. In an earlier version, not only did you need to find the spare gear, but this elevator was connected to a disabled generator that wouldn't operate until you also attached a crank and jump-started it with the gravity gun. Although it sounds simple, most playtesters got stuck here for many minutes. We kept simplifying until we hit the version you see here.
When the Vortigant discovers the extract, we wanted to do something to distinguish the nectar from all the other glowy alien substances that we've seen in the caves so far. Therefore, we had him perform a bit of a chant and had the extract give off a show of its own.
We had wanted to implement a generalized particle system for quite some time, and after Episode 1 we set out to create one. In previous Half-Life games, Each effect had been hand-coded by a programmer working with an artist. It was effective, but not easily scalable. Our new system drew upon the aspects we found most useful from team members who had worked with both real-time systems in games and offline renderers for movies such as The Lord of the Rings. The results were an artist-friendly, modular, component-driven system. Each system can have renderers which display the particle in some form, initializers which set up certain properties of the particle, operators which carry out actions upon the particle each frame, constraints which provide movement limitations such as collision, forces which impart complex dynamics, and emitters which determine how each new particle is created. Together they are plugged into a system as needed to be as lightweight or as complex as required for the effect. Each individual component is simple, but when combined can create rather complex dynamics. Furthermore, adding additional components to support the specific needs of a game or a mod is easily done. The results can be seen in everything ranging from the simple glows of the larval extract here, to the citadel effects, blood, smoke, hunter effects, portal effects, fire, and so forth. Dynamic effects are now in the hands of the artists, who can use them to create whatever is needed, from unique one-offs in specific levels to generalized effects for gameplay.